Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day two of the Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers Workshop. For those of you who spent time with us yesterday, I hope it was an enlightening and very educational. I'd like to welcome you today from the USDA Office of Partnerships and Public Engagement in collaboration with the Regional Rural Development Centers. We've invited you here to join us in a multi-day virtual workshop. So as I stated, today is day two. Goal is building community capacity around socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. We designed this workshop for community organizers and planners that work on this important topic of a state or community level, such as community planners, cooperative extension service providers, elected/appointed county and city officials, producers, serving organizations, cooperatives, and food systems professionals. Yesterday, we spent time with an open activity and talked about some definitions of the Farm Bill and provision updates. We highlighted you with the heirs property and land utilization workshop. And today we plan to open up with another opening activity that should kick off around 9:10. We want to talk about the partnerships, a little bit of innovations in market, forward to a break between 10:30 and 10:40. And then we'll step back into the virtual platform and deal with farm stress at 10:40 and mental health resources. At 11:15, we plan to have a discussion on equity and justice and wrap up today. I look forward to an enlightening opportunity for you. So advance to the next slide. Here are the things we hope that you take away. Learn about resources and strategies to meet emergent needs and challenges of socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. Examine up-to-date information on USDA programs. Engage in peer-to-peer connections among participants. Learn methods to assess public data to access needs. And develop stakeholder engagement strategies to build partnership and accomplish a shared goal. Those are some takeaways, so we hope that you take advantage of that. Helping us achieve that, we have identified a strong team that have been working together since about January of this year. But I want to introduce you to Dr. Rabasababa, a PhD in Tuskegee. Lourdes Elena South, she's in Natural Resource Conservation Services at the Stewardship Branch of the Easement Programs Division. Next slide, please. Michael Carlo, I don't think will be with us today, but if so, I look forward to having a conversation around natural resource specialists on the outcomes team, which is what he represents, is involved in resource inventory and assessment. Myself, here in forestry at NC State and working with USDA as a technical service provider. Next slide. Cynthia Soliel is a national outreach specialist for USDA Farm Service Agency, and she provides resources and material to the internal and external customers for FSA, which is Farm Service Agency programs. Kenya Nichols, a program director with U.S. Department of Ag, headquartered in Washington, D.C. And Dr. Sarah Rocker, who has been working with us, a rural socialist at the Northeast Region Center for Rural Development in Penn State. Renee Catakalis has been a food system advocate and writer in the Mid-Atlantic region for the past 15 years. Also an author of a book, The Chesapeake Table. Christine Sorensen is a partnership team member for the USDA Rural Development Innovation Center. Next slide. Katie Hickey, a Master's of Public Administration candidate at Cornell University, also working with the USDA Office of Partnerships and Public Engagement. And Mary Nelson Robertson, PhD, as an Extension Associate 3 and Project Manager for Mississippi State University Extension Services. David Bice is State Health Specialist and Associate Professor at Mississippi State University. Next slide. The session overview is identifying new partners, thinking across the value chain and what is the value chain. Benefits of a value chain strategy, coordinating planning, supporting and resource for value chain coordination. And here's our agenda for today, which we reviewed earlier. Next slide. And I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Sam, for kicking us off on day two, and also introducing, as you can see, quite a big team of diverse minds that have come together to bring you 2 days of information we're so excited that you all could join us. And for those that were with us yesterday, we're glad to have you back. For those that this is your first time joining, we're excited to have you. And if you missed yesterday's session, everything is being recorded, today's session as well, which if you registered, you will receive a follow-up email with the recording so you can go back and watch if you weren't here for the program yesterday. To recap, and if you were here yesterday, you know this, but we just want to recap who's in the room. You just saw who we are, and we're somewhat of a larger team bringing this information to you. But we wanted to let you know all who registered for this, who's interested in the topic of serving socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. And in sort of order by the prevalence who responded and are attending these workshops, we have nonprofits, our U.S. Department of Agriculture, land grant institutions, state and local government, public agencies, non-land grant colleges and universities, businesses, and faith-based organizations. We welcome all of you to the table, and we're so excited to have this opportunity to put our minds together and dialogue about how we can best serve socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. I also just want to point out that we have some geographic diversity in terms of the scope of which we all work, from the state to the national, some working across regions, some working at the more local level in cities and towns. And I think that there's room and innovation in particular with today's session, which is all about planning, process, and strategy to support the operations for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers and their well-being. It needs to be a collaboration at multiple levels. So this is very exciting to have this kind of diversity in the room today. With that, we have an opening activity. As you saw from the agenda today, there's going to be quite a bit of sort of presentations where we'll be sharing slides and sort of giving information for you just to receive. We also wanted to have a little bit of time in the morning here for some interaction and for you to get to know a little bit more who else is in the room in a more intimate way. So we have an opening activity in which we'll do a small group breakout through using Zoom breakout feature. And what this is going to do is we'll break out for about 7 minutes in groups of 5. It's randomly selected, so you don't know who your neighbor will be, but that's part of the excitement. And when we get to the small group breakouts, you can just share your name, your organization, maybe the state that you're from, and the region that you're working in. And we're going to answer this one question prompt this morning. What are your biggest challenges with programming and planning in serving socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers? We just want to kind of share what is really up for you right now. It kind of dovetails in what are you most excited to learn. But because today's session is so much about the nuts and bolts of planning, and especially access to markets, farm and mental health, as well as just some of the larger issues around structural racism that are affecting this population, we want to hear what's really up for you and what are you most excited to dive into. So welcome everyone back. It looks like we're all starting to come back from small groups. I hope that time sharing and meeting other faces was really fruitful for you all. Sometimes in these large, big technical meetings, it's difficult to really have those water cooler conversations or run into someone over the cup of coffee in the hallway. So we really value creating some time in these breakouts for you just to get to know your neighbor and see who's sitting virtually next to you. So we'll give another moment or two as folks are coming back in. And I'd like to invite anyone who would like to drop in the chat box, if you'd like to share maybe a theme that came out of some of the biggest challenges that you all are facing. You're welcome to share that with the large group if anything really was sticking there that you thought would be good to bring up to the group. And in general, I just would like to say that we can use the chat feature through the rest of today's conversation and even during the presentations for folks to type in if you have a thought that you'd like to interject or you have a clarifying question or if you have a resource that you'd like to share. We're going to be hearing about several different topics, and we recognize that we're not the only experts in the room, that you all might have that deep expertise. So just letting folks know that that chat channel is really used for all of those things, sharing resources, asking clarifying questions, giving affirmations for what you're hearing. We really want to continue to foster this kind of connectivity throughout the session today. So with that, let's just see here what our chat, um, a couple of themes that our folks are writing now in the chat that are difficult challenges, common challenges are outreach, um, resources to expand operations was definitely a theme that came up for some. I know in our group, in specific about outreach, it was actually the technological barriers and tech divides to being able to reach socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. And then I'm seeing here another chat, service providers needing to identify better ways to actually get into the communities and do outreach versus always asking the landowner to come to them. So how does the service go into the communities? Keep those coming. Those are great themes. While those are kind of coming in, I want to share out something that we did share in yesterday's session as well, which is that we did a bit of a survey when folks registered for today's webinar. And what we asked was the top challenges in general that you all thought were being faced by socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. And we took all those, there was over 220 responses to this question. We themed them into kind of main topic areas. And I just wanted to share this with you all. And hopefully this is maybe acknowledging or validating. Maybe you're getting some insight here about some of the kinds of topics that are coming up for your colleagues. The main ones really being that very prominent access to capital, credit, equipment, resources, land, training, culturally appropriate training, and then some deeper issues, systemic issues around racism, discrimination, institutional racism, and then market challenges, especially in the new time, and then I won't say the new normal, but just the new dynamic time of COVID is also exacerbated. So I'll just let your eyes kind of glance over this, take this in for one more moment. And then I want to share that in today's agenda, what we're hoping to do is address many of these topics, certainly not all of them, but what we have coming for you in today is talking about some new strategies to help farmers identify partners, to be successful, to have social support, to get access to capital, to get access to markets, to get access to stress and emotional and mental well-being. And then we're going to have a very robust discussion at the end today to close things out on equity, justice, and access. So this is what we have planned for today. And as you see also, we do have a welcomed break in the middle there. So we will have that time as well. And I'm just going to reach out to my other presenter colleagues. Is there anything else we'd like to say in the welcome before we move into the first agenda? Okay, well, with that, I would like to move us into the first agenda item, which actually, I know you're probably getting very used to my voice. You're going to hear me one more time as I present this first session, and then you won't hear me again till the very end. But I happen to be presenting the first topic today, which is on identifying partnerships. And what we want to bring to you today is some novel considerations about who else you might be able to be working with to support your clients and constituents of socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, folks that maybe you haven't thought of before. And so I just want to share a little bit about the arc of this first topic, which is we're going to be talking about a strategy or kind of a mindset of thinking and identifying partners. And we're using a value chain lens. And if you don't know what that term is, or if you've heard of it and you're not quite sure, rest assured that we're going to get into that. We're going to start with the definition of defining what is even a value chain. Why would we think about that to help farmers? And what's the benefits of thinking in value chains? And then once you think in that, how do you coordinate and plan? And what are then, after today's session, support and resources that you all can use to integrate this strategy moving forward? So that's our session overview. So with that, I'm going to dive right into a really fundamental definition of a value chain. So going back to very just traditional business school literature back in the 80s, a value chain is a set of processes that create additional value at each process along the step. So if we take here this journey of raw wheat to bread, every time that wheat undergoes a process, it's enhanced in its value. So when it gets harvested, when it gets milled, when it gets baked, when it gets bagged and shipped. And in the business sort of definition, if a particular company can, or an operation can integrate as many of these processes under one roof, they can achieve the maximum value for their product. And it helps them be competitive against other operations. So that's the traditional. Now, thinking about it in a more sort of cooperative sort of concept, you can have different businesses do different parts of these processes. So for example, a farmer can work with a miller, who can work with a baker, who can work with a distributor and a retailer, and each of them working together is adding value to the product, and they're each getting some value from doing their piece of the product. In this kind of concept, this is what in sort of more modern literature in the past 10 or so years, food systems researchers have been calling values-based supply chains. This is strategic business partnerships or alliance that are moving specialty kinds of products. And sometimes we talk about this not just being a value chain of adding money value, but that there's actually values that help bring all the partners together. So maybe it's a farmer and a processor and a buyer all work together because they care about the concept of local, or they care about keeping the economy local in their state, or they care about that it's organic, or that it's fair, or that it's a heritage breed. So those are the kinds of things, the kinds of reasons that partners might find each other. And in this values-based model where the partners, the businesses are working together, in the theory here is that it works the best when these partners are all sharing transparent information. They're also sharing the risk, and they're also sharing profits more equitably. Different than a more commodity system where, and traditionally in the commodity system, it's typically the farmer, the very beginning of the chain, who gets the least amount of money. And that's why we think about this for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, because a values-based supply chain model actually shares risk and profits more equitably over the entire chain. So when we think about where does that farm dollar go, this is again the partners that we need to be engaging and thinking about of where does the farm dollar go and how to get more money from the market back to the farmer, but and more equally distributed across the chain. So again here in this model, the question is who benefits? Well, and the theory is in the past 10 years, sort of the strategy has been that this is especially important for small farmers and processors and small and mid-scale processors, because they have specialty products like specialty and niche products that really just aren't competitive in the commodity system, and that they also need each other. This collaboration helps them achieve and get access to different markets and customers when they work together. This is a model, really, to take a quote from John F. Kennedy. It's not about competing with each other. It's about that the rising tide lifts all ships, so that when they work together for this strategy, they can create a market for all of them, but only when they work together. But it's not always sort of happy. You can also be a competitor and a cooperator, and that's where there's a kind of neat word of they're co-opetition or co-opetitionerators. Not really a great word, but I think you get the concept here. So why are we talking about this? Why is this coming up today? Well, we're talking about it because the USDA started talking about it. In 2014, there was a report put out called Food Value Chains, Creating Shared Value to Enhance Success. And they, in this particular report, said, you know, here's the value chain strategy. And it's really all about partners along the chain, recognizing interdependence and collaboration and supporting each other mutually, and forming alliances, forming business agreements around those shared values. Like we said, could be local to the state or to the region, could be a heritage crop, fair, organic, things like that. But then here's the piece that I think is really interesting. USDA also articulated the why. Why are they talking about it? And they also showed the need, just like some of the other sort of theorists did, that this is really the way that they think that it's best to move specialized products through non-commodity markets and achieve the highest value. It's not that you couldn't move a really special crop through a commodity market. It's just that the farmer themselves probably wouldn't get the highest value for it. And this is really an important strategy of working together so that small and mid-scale producers can compete and be economically viable. So I'm just going to give another little piece of history here, some terminology that I think might help you all think about planning and the way that you serve socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. If we think about the terms hard and soft infrastructure, you might have never thought of these terms before, but I think you might know what the content really is. So hard infrastructure is the concept of anything that's stuff that, that helps to support the building of a regional economy for food systems. So buildings are important, aggregation centers, processing facilities, greenhouses, distribution, refrigerated trucks. That's all the hard stuff. And you need to have that in place for actors to work together across the value chain. If there's no aggregation point, then how can folks aggregate? But also what's really critical to think about is soft infrastructure, relationships, knowledge, and networks. People knowing who each other is, what they have, and what each other needs is also critical for being able to use the hard infrastructure efficiently. And there was a really wonderful webinar sort of talking about talk is cheap, that maybe we don't need to always buy the fanciest truck or build that food hub quite yet. Maybe we just need to work on first establishing partnerships, then see what we all want, and then what kind of hard infrastructures do we need. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing of what comes first, but the idea is that both are important and we need to be investing and thinking about both. I just want to share a little bit of the history of funding that's gone into funding both hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure in the food systems realm, developed to especially lift up and raise success for small and mid-scale producers. So about over maybe 10 years ago at this point, there was a big push to invest in food hubs. These are aggregation centers that often do some aggregation, some light processing, maybe some packing, marketing. And then there was a realization that, oh my gosh, some of the food hubs are doing really wonderfully, but some are failing. And why is that? And this webinar came out also by USDA Rural Development in 2015, that said sometimes it doesn't really matter how expensive that refrigerated truck is or how nice that warehouse is. If you don't have the coordination, the connection, the system won't work, or the use of that facility won't work. And they got this idea in 2015 to start to fund the idea of soft infrastructure. And they were like, well, how do you fund soft infrastructure? Well, it's people power is what they came up with. And what I'm going to talk about now for just a few minutes is the history of funding this concept of people power, or what they called value chain coordination, the coordinating of all of the actors who are involved to make use and to move product to market. So what I'm going to talk about now just for a few minutes is this program called the Food Link Initiative. It was launched out of kind of that realization that the USDA wanted to fund soft infrastructure. And it was in partnership with the Wallace Center, a national nonprofit who does food systems work across the country. And this program, again, it identified what is a value chain. It recognized the importance of that value chains need to be functioning. And it suggested that there needed to be a particular coordinator in each approximate region to do the connecting work, to make sure that everyone here, you can see the little wheel here, from farmers and ranchers to restaurants to consumers to input supply, that they knew each other, that they were working together, and that they could have shared mission and start to collaborate. And here's just a little bit of the information from that press release. Some of you might be familiar with this program, but for those that aren't, this is a little bit about the initiative. It was a 3-year initiative. It really wanted to fund essentially the people doing it, and the way that they did it was they said these coordinators perform certain roles. They are market matchmakers. They help connect buyers to suppliers. They convene people together, sometimes in meetings or groups. They identify grants. They think about policy that's supportive or needs to change. They provide technical assistance to various different folks along the value chain. And they, in general, are innovating and helping bring new ideas. So this is the initial language that came out of that program. And just for full disclosure, I actually did my doctoral dissertation on that program. And so I got to spend 3 years with that entire program, watching the USDA and Wallace fund that work. They funded 13 communities of value chain coordinators to do that work. And then I was part of the evaluation team. And what I ended up coming up with and realizing is that there's a few more roles than just what they initially thought. And so I'm just kind of putting this out here now, that I believe that value chain coordination is a little bit more dynamic than just one person, and that the roles are, it's a growing list of roles. And I believe that many of you today are probably performing these roles in your work, aspects of helping to market, matchmake, provide technical assistance either to farmers or maybe processors or buyers, that you convene stakeholders to have meetings about the state of the food system or policy, innovating ideas, finding resources like grants, advocating for policy, holding people accountable to their agreements. The list goes on. We won't go too deeply into this right now, but I just kind of want to flash this up for you. This is the diversity and the complexity of the work that is needed to stitch together the social infrastructure in communities. So I do want to share a few like sort of big terminology pieces so that you can kind of talk about this and moving forward. So to zoom out now, value chain coordination really is this set of roles and activity that foster those linkages along the value chain. And what they do is it's creating added value to individuals, to the firms or the businesses, to the chain itself, and to the broader regional economy. And that there are professionals, there are individuals who do this work. Those are the value chain coordination professionals. And that the entities in which they work, it might be a business, it might be an organization, it might be local government. We just call them value chain entities. So there's just some terminology that we can use to talk about this. And you'll see that in some of the recent USDA Farm Bill language, as well as some of the Ag Marketing Service grant programs like the Regional Food Systems Partnership, value chain language is infused in a lot of those grants. And there's some new ones that have just come out in the past couple months. My colleague, Christine Sorensen, will speak a little bit more about that coming up. And my colleague, Renee, will speak a little bit more about the private philanthropic way that they're thinking about funding. So I just want you to kind of put a placeholder on this right now and be listening to the funding opportunities later about these terms. To go a little bit more though, I just want to share a little bit more about who's doing this work and have some reflection about where you all are in doing this work, and maybe who you, if you're not specifically doing it, who you work with that might be doing the coordinating themselves. So here are the kinds of businesses and organizations that are most often performing these roles. It's in the business side of things, those who are actually embedded in the value chain themselves. It might be the hubs who are aggregating food. It might be distributors. It might be a mid-tier processor who's right in the middle of the value chain. It might be the retail, like a retail co-op, for example. They might be performing some of those roles. But also support organizations can also perform value chain coordination. Local governments, food policy councils, nonprofits, economic development councils. These are all different areas of that you might be seeing this work. And someone just asked a question, I'm just going to respond to it really quickly. Is value chain language also applied to non-food? Yes, it is, absolutely. We're just talking about it in the context of food today, but there's some funding initiatives by the Ford Foundation back in, I think it was 2008, that funded an entire initiative in the Appalachia region on value chain coordination for other products besides just food, such as timber actually was one of them. And if you'd like to talk about that, you can ping me later. I'll share some resources. But yes, this is a concept that transcends all products. We're just talking about it today in the context of food, because that's where we are right now, but certainly in an expansive way. So I'm going to show you back this sort of diagram here of the value chain. This looks a little bit different than the first one I showed you with the wheat. But if you see on the left-hand side, input supply, all the way to the right, the end consumer, this is a way to think about and name and talk about the kinds of actors in a supply chain. So I like to talk about that there's transactional actors. That's the actors who are actually buying and selling the goods. And then there's this whole realm of support actors. They're not buying or selling the goods. They're not transacting any money, but they might have a keen awareness and also a keen interest in supporting the functioning of a value chain. Specifically, in the support realm, it could be nonprofits who have a mission to help farmers or local economy, or it might be a food policy council who cares about food access, or extension who wants to help the farmers, and to do so, they need to make sure that the markets are in place. So I just want to say that sometimes I don't think we always marry these two worlds of the support actor world and the transactional actor world, but they need each other. And that's part of the role of value chain coordination, is fostering linkages along the chain, but also to make sure that the folks who are doing business are getting the resources from the support world. It's also called the support ecosystem in some business literature, if folks are familiar with that. So then we go back to not only what's being coordinated, but who's doing the coordinating. Well, oftentimes it's in the value chain itself, it's folks in the middle are typically the ones who are doing the coordinating. It can be anyone, but most often what we're seeing is it's people who are in the middle of the chain are doing that extending work and support work on either side. And certainly there's a role for extension and nonprofits and local government to be also doing that coordination. Maybe you have seen different jobs like a local food systems coordinator on behalf of a city or a county, or extension agents who have this work. I think it's my sort of personal mission to keep elevating the concept of value chain coordination and start looking for new partners who are doing this work who don't know that they're doing this work, so that we can all have communal conversations about how to do it, what's working, and how to improve the strategy. So my question is, where are you in this diagram? Are you in the value chain itself? Are you buying and selling product? Or are you one of those support actors who have an interest in making sure that the value chains are working well? And you notice that, I keep saying, are you making sure that the value chains are working well? Maybe this is your first time thinking about the entire value chain. Maybe your work has just mostly been focused on farmers. And I think that it's okay to have that be our orientation. But if you don't take anything else away from this presentation, except for this one point, I'd like to just reiterate that I think to help farmers, sometimes we have to be thinking about the entire chain of where does their product ultimately go, and what are they getting back from that, and how are they experiencing being in the world and being in the marketplace with these other actors. Is it a good experience? Is it an equitable experience? Is it a fair experience? And if it's not, how do we foster that? So I just want to say a few last pieces here on how to identify, when you're doing partnership sort of investigation of like, who can I work with to coordinate and collaborate on value chains, you can look at it from a couple different ways. You can start from a product. Maybe you really care, or your particular region is really big on meat or produce or dairy. You can just start to pick one product and make a map outward and say, who's everyone that might be involved in dairy in this particular region? So that's one way to do it, is focusing on a particular product and starting to look for partners from there. You can also think about it from market channels. Maybe what guides your work is not about a single product. Maybe it's about getting food into schools, or getting food into hospitals, or getting food into local restaurants. So you can also think about it of, who's everyone that I need to work with across the entire value chain and in the support ecosystem who cares about grocery stores or restaurants or K through 12. A third way to think about your work is, maybe you care about it from a geographic focus. Maybe you care about all the market channels and all of the products, but you just focus on a particular county. Here's one example of a value chain coordination professional who's hired in the city of Lexington, and their job is to coordinate everything that happens in a particular county that feeds the area of Lexington. So that's one particular way to look for partners. And the last way to look for partners is, maybe it's all about the values. Maybe geography is somewhat important, and the market channels and the products are diverse, but maybe you really just care about who wants to work with organic, or who wants to work with the concepts of equitable trade or fair trade. So that's a fourth way that you can look for partnerships. And I'm going to kind of wrap up this part of the session now with a few just sort of reflection and discussion questions for you all, which is, of the roles here that I've presented, which ones are you currently performing? And, thinking about which ones might you need in your area to help farmers that aren't currently being performed. And that gives you kind of a signal of, if you're not performing them and you don't know who is, maybe who is performing that could be something for you to look into. And another thing to think about is, how are you currently planning? Are you doing it by region, product, market channel, or by some kind of value? Or what would work best, thinking about your farmer constituents that you're working with? And then just that third question of who's out there for you? Who are the folks that you're working with along the value chain? Who's in that support ecosystem? And if you don't know who they are, who might that be? What's the brainstorm look like? So I'm going to stop here and just sort of take any questions that folks might have. I'll also read the chat as well about this before I move on and pass it over to my colleague Renee to talk a little bit more about partnerships in the context of funding. So any questions from the group? By the way, I know we're a very large group. We're over 80 people, but you can unmute your microphone if you'd like to do so. And if this is just like either super easy and you totally get it, or if you're just like, whoa, taking this all in, take a few moments. With that,
I have a question. The point about relationship building is so important, because that has been the key to developing even the smallest scale markets, especially with the socially disadvantaged farmers. But how do we, as someone who's working as a value chain coordinator, find ways to provide more paid jobs for people to do that? Because so often you find folks spending lots of volunteer time, which is maybe not as consistent or reliable as maybe farmers or vendors, or ultimately buyers would like to make those relationships. So how do, thinking about the future, creating spaces where those folks who do all that work can have paid jobs where they're recognized for their work?
Yeah, that's a really amazing question. And I'm going to shout out one answer, and then I'm also going to say to be continued by my colleagues Renee and Christine with some funding conversations later. But the first thing I'll say is that some of this work is embedded in other jobs. So some of the work of coordinating, I think, is actually happening in, for example, extension. And that's a paid line item, and they're just kind of starting to have more increased awareness of, in order to help farmers, we actually have to also help processors, or at least help the connectivity to the processors, to the retailers, and various markets. So some of it, one answer is that maybe this is just more about not having a specific person whose title is value chain coordinator, but rather that you have your title, but that you integrate value chain coordination into what you do. The other is that, and this has been tried, I'd say, for what I've seen, mostly by grants, is that it's oftentimes there's grant funding that goes to invest in a particular local foods coordinator for a region. I often see that more in urban areas than in rural areas. And there's various objectives, I think, when it's the city or local government who is funding this work. Oftentimes it's to help the consumers, like to help build the food security or food shed of a particular region, and not necessarily for the farmer. So I guess one of my sort of considerations or concerns back to how is the work funded is making sure that however it's funded, that the priority still remains with particular attention to producers and farmers, who are the ones who are historically most not well served in terms of loss of profit in the traditional commodity markets. So that's a piece there. I will just say one other last thing, that the grant, the Food Link project that I talked about, which is the initial funding from USDA Rural Development and Wallace Center, they had the idea of just funding single coordinators for a particular region. And that was a really great pilot, but also there's some learnings there that this work doesn't happen by just one person or even just one organization. And that's not really a sustainable funding model in the end, because if you think about one person stitching together, and even as amazing and talented as they might be, and maybe they have all of these skills, or at least, I don't know, 70% of these VCC role skills, the moment that they move or take another job, the entire piece crumbles. So from sort of thinking about it from a resilience or a network perspective, the more people you have co-performing and collaborating on doing coordination and working together as a network for a particular region or particular product, the better, because it becomes more of a shared thing. The knowledge is shared, and then it's resilient in case any one of the coordinating entities disappears. I could talk for literally 5 hours about this topic because I love it so much, but in the interest of not doing that, to make sure that people stay awake this early in the morning, I'm actually going to just say, if you have additional questions, please just private chat me, or you can write the chat to the entire group. We'll have some more Q&A at the end of today's session. And my colleagues Renee and Christine are also going to be talking more about funding, so I think that'll answer some questions. And Christine will also be talking about value chains as part of her innovations in markets. So with that, I'm going to just say that a couple of resources to leave you with is that there's a National Value Chain Coordination online discussion group. I'm actually one of the co-coordinators. This is with the Wallace Center's Food System Leadership Network. I'll post that link in the chat if you want to join it, meet other people who are doing this work. It's a great online place to share what's going on. And I'm also going to share in the link the Food Link project website, which was this national funding initiative for value chain coordination. You can read a lot about the kinds of evaluations and early impacts that we saw, some strategy, connect with other people who are doing the work. And also some resources upcoming. There's going to be some grant and funding opportunities for how to fund this in Christine's session later. And then there's my contact information if you're performing this work and want to talk more about it. It's one of my most favorite things ever to talk about, so I'd be happy to speak with you. With that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Renee to speak more about from the philanthropic world and partnerships in that area. Renee, over to you.
Great, thanks. Good morning, everyone. My name is Renee Katakalos, and I represent an organization called Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems Funders. So we're a nonprofit that works with funders. We work to amplify the impact of the philanthropic and investment communities in support of just and sustainable food systems. Funding is, of course, a critical component of your work as intermediaries to socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, and it's critical to the success of those farmers and ranchers as well. And just to connect to what Sarah was just talking about before I go into the specific things I wanted to say, I think that the value chain coordination conversation is so important. And as Sarah was saying, identifying where it shows up in different places is also important. The work around the Food Link project helped to familiarize people with the language and with the concept, and it also served as a proof of concept of how value chain coordination works. And I think that when you're looking at funding and looking at getting beyond grant funding for these things, or expanding the places in which you can get funding to support those functions, as was asked about, I think pointing back to these kinds of proof of concept programs that have shown what the value is that this kind of work brings to the particular sector that you're working in is very important, and kind of connecting it to that same language that the USDA and that these other partners have already been using can really help to raise the familiarity of other funders and help other funders to connect to where they've seen that this has worked before. And that certainly makes a stronger case for the funding of it. So the federal government, primarily through USDA, is far and away the most significant source of funding for work around supporting socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, period. And certainly around value chain coordination as well. But other sources of funding come into play where they can provide the required match for programs that may be funded by USDA. Other sources of funding can support ancillary services or other preconditions that are not eligible under the federal funding program you may be looking at. And outside sources of funding can also be the conduit for strengthening local and regional relationships that really undergird the efficacy of your programs. I think lots of times we think about finding funding for the hard infrastructure pieces of the work that Sarah talked about, but funding for the soft infrastructure of relationships is also important. Not only funding the work that creates relationships such as value chain coordination, but thinking of funders as partners and building relationships with those funders and with the funding community is also a really important part of that soft infrastructure as well. One thing we have been glad to see kind of in the philanthropic world is how the USDA has explicitly recognized funders as partners in building capacity for local and regional food systems. On this slide, the 5 kind of groups of organizations that are listed here actually are the eligible partners that were a part of the RFA for the new Regional Food Systems Partnership Grant, which was put out by USDA for the first time this year and recently closed. I was honored and happy to be a part of the review panels for this program and get a chance to look at some of the proposals that came in there, which a lot of great work is being proposed there, an opportunity to really focus on funding that infrastructure building, that networking in regions. Part of the work that we're going to be doing at SAFSF is to really get more private philanthropy involved in those partnerships. One thing I would say, I was a little bit disappointed that there weren't more philanthropic partners in the proposals that I was able to see. We saw a lot of institutions of higher education as one of the eligible partners, and state agencies and regional authorities to a lesser extent. But what I want you to go away with from today is really a broader thinking in broader scope about who partners can be on any kinds of programs that you're doing, especially in this funding area. So I want to talk a little bit about just the first 2 groups of partners that are on this slide. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about those. So state agencies and regional authorities include a variety of organizations that may be publicly funded or may be public-private partnerships that promote economic development in general. They may promote rural development or agricultural development specifically in a defined state or region. These groups sometimes run their own grant or loan programs. They may offer dedicated matching funds for federal or other kinds of programs, or different kinds of cost share programs for farmers. And depending on your state, these may or may not be specifically targeted to socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. Nevertheless, it's a funding source that this group of producers should be aware of and tap into, and may not be tapping into as much as they could. So one example, I actually, as I said, I live in Maryland and have been involved in a lot of regional food systems work here in Maryland. And one of the groups that falls into this category is MARBIDCO, which is the Maryland Agriculture and Resource-Based Industry Development Corporation. So we call it MARBIDCO. But among the programs that they offer, they have an urban agriculture commercial lending incentive grant. They do a dedicated matching grant program for the USDA Value Added Producer Grant Program. And in the current situation, they've also been offering a Pandemic Adjustment Equipment Grant Fund. So these kinds of organizations exist all over the country. And I'll have a resource in the next slide, not when I'm done with this, that can get you started on determining who those groups might be in your area if you're not familiar with them. So to look at philanthropic organizations, these include traditional grant makers. So I'm gonna, as I see there's a question about grant makers is very vague. It definitely is. But traditional grant makers would be private foundations, family foundations, the kinds of organizations who you may see supporting other activities in your community, you know, who basically put out grant openings from time to time. Some of them do not do open grant calls either. So some of them you cannot get a proposal to unless you have some relationships there. And this is where kind of building the relationships within the grant making community comes into play. But also community foundations are grant makers. These tend to be more open organizations that people can get into. A community foundation is a regional kind of almost a holding organization that either runs smaller grant makers work. Say I happen to be an individual who inherited some money from my family and I want to do grant making with it, but I'm not big enough to call myself a foundation or to have some staff or run programs. I can put my money with a community foundation, which then will either help me identify people or organizations in the community that they already work with that are in line with the kinds of things that I want to fund. Or I can say, I want my money to be a part of a larger food and farm fund that you as a community foundation are running, and the community foundation runs an open call for funding proposals, and then I'm able to fund that way. So there are a lot of different ways that grant makers can be working, especially place-based grant makers can be working in a region or a locality. There is also a growing category of organizations, which may be foundations or maybe individuals or maybe other types of organizations that are actually investing in sustainable agriculture and food systems, meaning not making grants that here, this is money that you have and you can use it and I don't need it back from you, but investing in other ways, which may be low or no interest loans. Foundations and different kinds of organizations are setting up revolving loan funds. This is coming into play around land acquisition, land trusts, and other things that specifically apply to farmers, in which case they may be setting up a loan against a business that is expected to return some type of revenue, a revenue producing business. But that loan can be done as a no interest loan, so that as the revenue starts to come in, it is paid back, and then it goes into a fund that then can help other businesses or nonprofits who need that money. Sometimes foundations or these organizations can step in just to make loan guarantees, where they're not actually providing any money to an organization, but an organization that is on the cusp of growth, or an organization that has a promise of, say, a USDA grant that is coming in, but there's a particular amount of time in which there's a lag in getting those funds, and some bridge loans are needed. Sometimes there are organizations that will make those bridge loans, but they need a guarantee, and a foundation may be able to step in and say, yeah, we know this organization, we know that's coming, we're going to do the guarantee in case it doesn't happen, which in most of those cases, they're not going to be called for that. But knowing that they are there for it gives that lender that added degree of confidence in making that loan. So these are things that, again, are based on having relationships with those lenders and with folks in the community. There are also new funding vehicles coming up, especially in response to the structural racism issues that have really been kind of burst onto the public consciousness around ownership of farmland and farm wealth, that are coming up specifically to help build wealth and farmland ownership in BIPOC communities. Programs like the Black Farmer Fund, which is starting up in the Northeast right now, but we expect to see more of those types of programs actually being developed in the near future. So grant makers can certainly be a source of matching funds, but they can also participate in these other ways. Another group to think about, or group of organizations, are community development finance institutions, or CDFIs, which are nonprofit lending institutions that are set up specifically to work with economically and socially disadvantaged businesses, including farm and food businesses. And in certain regions of the country, we're even seeing a few of these really developing kind of a specialty in working with farmers. So I think it's important to think about approaching funders as partners early on in projects that you're working on, because this brings the added potential of building relationships that can bring in others in the community. mean, private funding is certainly competitive, just as USDA funding is. And there are always more requests than there are available funds. But one funder who may not be able to support a project for whatever reason, whether that's their funding is done for the year or whether it's not the type of funding they do, they may be willing to help make introductions to other funders who can help, or whose goals and mission are more in line with your project's goals and needs, or with that farmer's or rancher's project's goals and needs. So I think collaboration is a key outcome of partnerships, and offers a lot of benefits beyond the actual funding. As important as that is, really that soft infrastructure of building those relationships can be equally important. I have seen this specifically happen within our organization, where funders who are members of Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems funders will reach out to others within our network, or even to us as staff, to say, an organization that we funded in the past has come to us with this particular project. We are not in a position to do it right now, but I'm looking for someone who does X, Y, and Z. We know this group, they are someone we would vouch for, and we're just trying to make some other introductions for them. So that does happen within the funding world. And knowing funders and being exposed to them, it puts you in position for that kind of, to be the beneficiary of those kinds of collaborations, hopefully. So the final slide that I have just includes a few websites where you can start identifying some of the potential funding partners in your area. In terms of regional commissions, there is a website that starts with, it's the National Association of Regional Commissions, and it's a place to start looking at state associations that may be in your area. But there are a lot of these groups that cross lines, like, the Appalachian Regional Commission or groups like that. So, but once you start looking, you'll be able to identify those. Once you kind of know they're there, then they're a good place to start looking. With philanthropy, our website, safsf.org, does have a list of the majority of our actual members, and that's a good place to start, just like kind of going to the websites of those foundations and looking at what their missions are. We do not do direct grant matchmaking, but we make that particular part of it available. Members who are looking for people to know about what they're doing, you can find them there. Also, the United Philanthropy Forum is an organization that it's kind of an umbrella organization for a lot of different philanthropic work. And at their website directory, which is listed there, you can find links to regional associations of grant makers in your area. So in addition to organizations like mine that bring funders together around a functional or issue area that they like to support, in our case, sustainable agriculture and food systems, there are also groups that bring funders together on a regional basis. So there is the Washington Regional Association of Grant Makers in my region. There are these kinds of councils of grant makers. There's the Southern Region Council of Grant Makers, and they tend to be, each state tends to have a group of grant makers, and then sometimes cities or regions will also have them. Sometimes there will be food funder groups within those groups as well, but don't limit yourself only to groups that say that they fund food and agriculture, because there is a lot of intersectionality, as you probably know. Funders that fund rural issues, funders that fund health issues, funders that look at environmental issues. Sometimes there can be some cross-pollination to farming and ranching issues as well. And then finally, there's a link to a locator for community development financial institutions, CDFIs, which is a good place to look. For instance, as farms and food businesses started trying to get their loans in, their PPP loans around the pandemic, it was a lot of CDFIs that were in that kind of second wave of funding, able to work with small food businesses to get their submissions in for that program. So they're there for that kind of work. And then a final thing that I'm gonna post into the chat box, a link to another page on our website, where in the pandemic response, we started to collect links to funds that were set up specifically to provide COVID response around food and agriculture work. And some of these funds are regional. Some of these funds are specifically focused on Black or Latino or Asian Pacific communities or Native American communities. Some are specifically focused on farm worker or farmers' needs. And so that's another resource to look at, although it is pandemic specific. It's a good place to look at kind of who was interested in these kinds of issues and to start to follow the relationships that they'll be having once we get out of pandemic response mode as well. I will stop there.
Thanks so much, Renee. And actually, I'm going to turn things over now. We're going to hold our questions for a little bit later and send things over to our colleague, Christine Sorensen, who's going to bring us into our next agenda item today on innovations in markets.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Renee. I'm going to ask my colleagues to just double check me that just nod that you're seeing the right screen. Awesome, thank you so much. My name is Christine Sorensen, and just a real brief check-in on the agenda. We've got, of course, the Innovation at Markets right now, and then we will be doing a break. So just to get started, I work with the USDA Rural Development Center. I'm the management and policy analyst there for the Innovation Center. And we, of course, with USDA Rural Development and the over 40 programs that we do have, I would call our team within the Innovation Center more generalists, and where we really look at that soft infrastructure and those relationships and the partnerships. We're the partnership team. And so that's kind of my background, and that's kind of the focus of what I'd like to talk to now. In this session, we know that social distancing and other response strategies have really upended ag markets throughout the country, including the local and regional food markets. And that's transformed the way that we shop, the way we access our food, even the way we eat. And so that transformation has brought with it an increase in interest in buying direct from our local farmers. It's also given the ranchers and fishermen and forestry just a way to maybe be available to that increased market for that local connection. But it's also, as families really look at that food security. And so as we in this whole session, we're looking at those opportunities and those challenges and how can we work through that. This session will really also talk about some resources for you. And it's really broken up into kind of two different focuses or audiences. You know, we've got the individuals, we've got the individual producers where they're creating different ways of marketing their product, and they're also utilizing different platforms. We also know that they're working really hard at staying engaged and connecting in this social distancing environment. And so that's a very important thing for them to consider. We know that we got really high capacity folks in the room here, in our Zoom room, right? And it's really important for me to just keep in mind as we go through these things, I'm talking with my hands, that it's going to be almost like these are some tools that you can use with your clients or within your community. And so when I talk about individuals, it would be how you can help your producers. Then I also like to just kind of touch on the value chain and just really around those system adaptations that we've been seeing in some of the research around that. And that's the pivot, right? That is the word in regard to what folks are talking about. And so, and those relationships, gosh, what a perfect segue from what Sarah and Renee have talked about. It's just been really important to really talk further on this. So let's get through some examples. We know that that a lot of these producers, after they've adjusted and heightened their personal protection equipment, they got to work finding new channels of distribution. They started creating ties on online sale outlets, or they did home delivery. We know that those have gotten started. we also know that those smaller enterprises, a lot of our local small producers, they can sometimes respond quicker to market disruptions. And that sometimes that gives them the agility to really adjust, shift, and pivot, to use that word again. And so that is something that we've seen. We know that there's challenges though. And so I'll kind of talk about those, and I'd love to hear more challenges if you want to pop those into the chat as we're talking. This is an example of how some of the farmers markets have adapted. This is a poster that was created and posted for the public. We know some markets have seen over a 200% increase in SNAP redemptions. A really informative presentation that I just most recently was part of is a farmer market coalition manager in Kentucky. Now, she discussed the challenges and opportunities, but they now, so if you look at this as an opportunity and what we're in the midst of, is that they now have a stronger relationship with their state's health department. Which is very important as you look at the distribution of food. They also have formalized the relationship. So them as a coalition may have met sporadically. They may have almost that face-to-face is almost taken for granted. And so now they have formalized the relationship, and they either get on a Zoom call or they connect through that virtual platforms that more and more people are using. They've even had some of those unlikely suspects and partnerships, right? Where a distillery made hand sanitizer and donated it for patrons to use at the farmers market. And they've also had Corn Growers Association, which has never been a partner before. They've become a sponsor. So I think at as we look at these opportunities per se, is really those opened avenues to where maybe there are different and unusual partners available, like Renee talked about. Some of our those partnerships that can be created now through these changes that we're going through, right? A lot of our farmers markets have gone to the online ordering. Now, I want to pause here because I think it's important to address the challenges to a lot of this online, and whether that's the relationship building or it's the online ordering, and really selling a product. We know that there's challenges in broadband. We know that there is challenges in access. And so I think that those partnerships, and hopefully I'll show an example later on, we're really where we can actually align the work with other organizations that may have greater capacity in our weaknesses. And what I mean is that if there is an organization, and Extension is such a huge partner, I'll call that out right now, in a lot of the work that USDA does in the field, is that there's capacities out there for e-connectivity and really assisting those communities into accessing online platforms, or even the knowledge and education of increasing that kind of capacity for our communities. So I guess I would call this, section definitely around those unlikely partnerships that can be created. We know that there's curbside pickup and delivery. Some producers are finding new ways to get the products. They're setting up in parking lots. We know that they're communicating as much as they can. They drive up in the orders, and then they load them directly in the car. Definitely in this Nest example, their code word is make sure your trunk is empty, right? Making sure that, when you do come, that there's the room. Now let's look at the challenge on this, right? So what we've heard is that they've had some farmers markets or food hubs, and we'll talk about a food pantry here pretty soon, have had to adapt even where they locate. So we talked about a parking lot. And in that example, a lot of these places have had to move and get to a place where it was actually open. There might have been a business parking lot that was closed and they're no longer available. but having that conversation of access and those populations that because of the pandemic, and whether that's an elderly generation or if it's those that don't have access to the online, those have been the pivots. Those have been some innovations that we've seen where it is more of a putting a poster up at the grocery store, or it's been more of that integration of the written word that's been doing that. Now, USDA, and I don't want to get too far off on my slides here, but USDA is really, the strength of the rural development programs really comes by the intermediaries and the partners. And so a lot of the funding opportunities are where we strengthen through our grants and loans the capacity and the delivery of services from our intermediaries. Renee talked about the CDFIs, the nonprofits, the organizations such as probably a bulk of those in the field and on this call, where we can build up your capacity and funding so that you guys can do the good work, right? That's a really important component of the funding, because we have field offices, they are your partner, right? And whether that's Natural Resource Conservation Service or the Farm Service agencies, specifically, they are in the field and they can be your partner through that. And so I think that relationship is important as we talk about more and more things. So of course, community supported agriculture, CSAs are an example of seeing that increased demand. They are a steady cash flow for our producers. They are able to market in some instances in a longer season. And then they also have a value added component. Maybe they also add bread, or they add homemade jam. That kind of a added value is really important for the bottom line of their producer. Now, I believe in marketing, and not that I have a background in it, but I know that the outreach part is what I'm passionate about. And so in this instance, if you want to put the hat on of a producer and they're sitting across the desk with you and they're really overwhelmed, right? It could be the best case example that because of the COVID, they have more and more. They're oversubscribed for their CSA, or they're out of produce already, right? And they know that they're going to have their kind of cooler season crops coming up, but you know, what the heck am I going to do? I don't have time for marketing. Just a couple little things that can be part of your conversation with them can be that really discouraging in thinking that they don't have time to market, because this is the opportunity for them to build the trust with their clients and their customers. This is really a time for them to maybe gather emails and stay connected with their customer, and say, hey, a check-in once a week saying, did you know, hey, we got these crops coming up? Or did you know that we're creating a small Facebook group where we're really going to talk about, you know, what your needs are going to be in the fall? Also another component is really where you're adding value. I know I probably say this word quite a bit, but where you're adding value and showing value up front. And another example is where we had a food hub do online food preparation classes, free classes, right? Facebook Live or something to that effect, where they're actually giving value even before the consumer buys something. And that can kind of lead and build strength for those leaner times that maybe when the pandemic is lessened, that those customers stay and that trust is already built. Okay, so let's move on. This is just a quick check-in on the value chain and how some of those system adaptations has happened. We know that a lot of this is really a disruption in most instances to the distribution the produce wasn't getting to the grocery stores. It wasn't getting to the retail stores. It was the retail stores in those areas were closed. And so when that disruption happened, it was highlighted that those relationships and the communication channels became even important. We have talked about this with Sarah and Renee, where we can't say enough how those relationships and those communication channels are so important to getting the access to the consumer, but also of creating a system where we've got some resiliency happening, right, for our organizations, such as what you guys work with, that we've got some resiliency for our producers, and that creating those relationships now is really important. Now, both Sarah and I separately, without knowing, made this little arrow where the world was going on, and it was going one way and then ran into this COVID wall of disruption. And now this little arrow is adjusted and positioned in a new direction. And so as an organization that possibly you have a different focus, or you have different avenues that you're working, building those connections with the organizations and businesses is really important to kind of build up that supply chain and to, serve those communities. A lot of this we discuss is really in finding those places where it's important to find the partners that understand that the supply chain is broken. I think that organizations aligning with shared missions is really important. Aligning those partners that are philosophically aligned with you. So if you're messaging your work and you're getting the word out in the ways that you can, that there's going to be like organizations that can work with you. A lot of our organizations started with assessments and surveys. They did a check-in. They either did a check-in with their producers or their clients or their customers or their coalition members. And then that way, it's not like we're inventing from scratch, but we're working together on this kind of shared baseline of where we want to go. There's also having a lot more conversations with those unlikely partners. And just to reiterate that, kind of keeping your mind open that if anything, this pandemic has evened the challenges for organizations and businesses. And I'll have an example of that. Let's take a brief commercial break, because I think it's really important that we talk about those funding sources and the resources that are available for you. So I've got a lot of information here just to let you know, and the links are all here for you. So whether I will go through this quickly, is sometimes all of these resources are consolidated in one beautiful slide, right? And this is where this America's Healthy Food Financing Initiative is just a really important place for you to go. A lot of things that you've heard, you've heard about the Wallace Center, you've heard about different USDA Rural Development, there's going to be programs there. But all of these different components are found on this website underneath the resources. And as you know, this is going to be available to you, and so these links will be live for you. An important thing that I wanted to pull from that resource is the policy network, because we've talked a lot about system development and disruption, but also access. And it's an important looking at as our schools, whether they go back into session or not, is food security for our youth. It's also food security for a lot of our populations. And so this is kind of a really nice resource that I wanted to highlight. And that is the link. So it's called Policy Link, and it's available for you. Like I said, this will be available in the handout. So we've touched briefly on some of those specific grants. I know the deadline is coming, in another 4 or 5 days, right? But the reason I wanted to highlight this is that a lot of times it takes planning, of course, to apply for these grants. I'm not telling you anything different, but the idea is to really get in and look at the Federal Register notice for the year before. Look at the fact sheet. Check in on what are some of the things that might fit in the work that you're doing. And then also a graded adage is don't chase the dollar as much as have the plan and then have the money fit your plan. It's just really important as you look and you plan for this next year and the next services that you provide. So let's get into some of those resources that are available. And just know there's not a link on this page, but there's going to be links later where you can access more information. Now, some specific resources that support policies and programs, especially around marketing, are the Farmers Market Promotion Program and the Local Food Promotion Program. These are very specific to the Ag Marketing Service, and those are wonderful resources. Talk about them all the time because they're such great resources, and we hear a lot where a lot of the food hubs and the farmers markets get started because of that first FMPP. Now there's especially crop block grants. A lot of times these are distributed from your state organizations and they're available to you that way. There's some additional resources are supporting production. I mentioned and it was mentioned earlier, the Value Added Producer Grant. That's a USDA grant where you're adding value. So if you've got the berries turned into jam and that type of thing, that's directly to the producer. The Rural Business Development Grant, this is a grant that is used in organization if you're going to be providing technical assistance. That's that intermediary I talked about earlier. The Business and Industry Cares Funding, that's our, what for short we call it the BNI. That has got some additional funding tied to it because of the CARES Act. Farm Storage Facility Loan Programs, National Organic Certification Cost Fair Program. Now, more importantly, there's a link there for you, and these will all be discussed on these websites for you. There's a lot out there. There's a lot of information out there. That's why it's really kind of important to really have that plan in place and then kind of see what money fits you. An important system, right? And if you can almost see a lot of cooperatives are part of a value chain or the food chain in some instances. And so I really wanted to highlight that there's cooperative development centers that we fund and in rural development, and theirs are available for you as assistance in your communities. And I've got a whole bunch of information here for you, but also very important is the Ag Marketing Service. There's a link there for you. And then our National Institute of Food and Agriculture, especially if you're an extension, you know those. But those are just really important links for you to kind of keep in mind, and those technical assistance that can be available to you. So let's take a little break and talk about that example that I wanted to highlight. Now, in this instance, the food bank, and this is a really large food bank. It's actually the largest hunger relief organization in this state. And they changed their whole food distribution model in regard to the health crisis. They are where they've had to have that, stop their direct connection and handoff, right, of their food boxes. And so they needed to find a better way. They schedule appointments, they service food pantries across the state. So how could they get this distributed? How could they have many hands doing the work, right? And so they actually partnered with LL Bean. And this conversation really happened of where the business itself found that they are really, they're really good. Hey, we're really good at fulfillment. We pick, we pack, we distribution, we know how to ship boxes, right? And so this food bank actually partnered with this private entity and really found that alignment for what was needed for the food pantries for the state. We know that the demand is huge. And so this was an instance where there was a pivot and a partnership and an opportunity that was provided to get the word out. All right, let's get to some additional resources. if there's one resources that you do keep in your back pocket, this is one of them. This kind of is, and it's really nicely put together because it gives you the headings. You'll see, you know, hey, I want more information about processing, or I want more information about markets or consumers. Then all of those are highlighted there for you. And this is found at that link, and it really helps you kind of figure out the matrix of all of those resources that can be available, loans, grants, all those good things through the USDA. So the AMS also, Ag Marketing Service, also has some really great resources in regard to directories. There's directories of farmers markets and the on-farm markets, CSAs, and food hubs. So if you think of it as a practitioner and you have a producer that's in a certain area, this would be a great resource for them as they look at those directories and find places that are possibly somewhere that they can actually get their, you know, their product out. It helps the consumer really find that local food that's close to them. And so there's other different platforms, and you can filter by different locations and products. There's also the market news. They have information on marketing conditions. They've also found the commodities at major domestic and international wholesale markets, direct contacts with sales, suppliers, brokers, buyers. You know, we're talking about the supply chain here. Where are those different avenues? And then there's also the publicly available data. And it allows you to kind of look at the trend and to compare the prices. That was something important for a lot of the producers that I talked to, is really comparing pricing, because pricing can be tough. And it's something to where it's sometimes the most important thing as you market your product, of making sure you're getting your value and that there is a profit. One thing that actually our team worked on is the guide, the COVID-19 Federal Rural Resource Guide, because what we identified is that there's a lot of federal resources put out right away in regard to the COVID-19 resource response. So this is maybe not specific to local food, you know, farmer and ranchers, but this is a guide to everything federal response, and it's by the population. So if you're a for-profit business, or you're an organization, or you're a government entity, this guide is all put together so that you can find those resources, and it's updated monthly to that for your use, and it's found online, and it's found at that link. If I keep clicking, all right, that'll be there for you. Now there's additional resources. Like I said, it's nice click-throughs, and it's really nice when it's all put together in one spot, right? So farmers.gov has all of these. They've got the directory tool, they list the programs, and they also, more importantly, they help you find your local service center, because having that relationship with your area staff and your field staff is so important. And one other caveat on that is that you start talking to that staff from the very beginning, like if you have an idea, and you keep asking, and you keep looking for that staff person that's going to be your contact, right? We've got some links for you. In fact, it'll be this next one. Let me click through on who can be your help and who can you find to assist with you. And that local field office, you know, for the NRCS and FSA, that'll be on that previous slide. USDA Rural Development, we have rural offices in all of our states, and area offices and state offices. And so that's where a good start is. Also, the Office of Partnerships and Public Engagement, that's their link. They've got liaisons in a lot of the states, and if not, that they definitely cover an area that can assist you. And so also, when it gets to the bottom line, right, and really around what have we been talking about in 3 separate presentations, right, is really that the relationship and the connections that you can make and cultivate and utilize at this point is the pivot. And it's really what brings success. And it's the soft, we call it soft infrastructure, but really we could call it the hard infrastructure in some instances, because those social connections really can be the bedrock for the work that needs to be done. All right, thank you guys. We're gonna pop it over to questions and discussions, but gosh, I know I got into the break, so sorry about that.
Thank you so much, Christine. And I just want to say to everyone, this has been already a lot of action-packed information for this early in the morning. We hope that this first section has given you some new frameworks, some new language, as well as a ton of resources. Some of the links we've put in the chat already. Christine also mentioned that some of the links you'll just get to have all in one nice package is part of your thank you for coming today. You're going to get an email with the recording as well as the slides, so that'll all be there. And we are actually going to take a break now, as promised. It's only going to be a 6 or 7 minute break. I hope that's all right with everyone. So why don't you take some time now? We'll rejoin at 10:45. That'll just push us back about 5 minutes. So go grab a cup of coffee, stretch your legs. We'll see you in about 6 or so minutes for our Farm Stress Mental Health presentation. Thank you all.